Hey guys, welcome back to Taylor Tech. Today we are going to be taking a tour of a mixer and going through some of the components and concepts on a mixer, as well as talking about terminology, so that in future videos it'll be easier for you to understand things that I'm talking about without having to explain them every time. Okay, so the first thing is, if you haven't watched the Audio 101 video, you really need to go watch that now to get a foundational understanding of what audio is and what sound is and what signal is, because we'll be using some of that information as we go through our tour of the mixer. So if you haven't watched that video, go ahead and click on the little icon up there, go take a look and come back and we'll get going. So there's three kind of foundational concepts that we're going to cover regarding mixers first before we really dive into the components. Those three concepts are channels, busing, and routing. A channel is quite simply a single source of audio. So channels can be mono or they can be stereo. Second concept is a bus and busing. In audio, when you talk about an audio bus or a sound bus in a mixer, you're talking about a place that various channels are pooled to. So you're combining channels to a bus. All mixers have one bus, which is the main bus. And most mixers will have several other. They'll have auxiliary buses, FX buses, a solo bus, a control room bus. Some will have, sub mixes, which count as a bus because that's a place you can pull audio to. That concept, it's a little bit nebulous, but hopefully it makes sense. That's those places that several channels, which are our sound sources, are pooled to a bus. The final concept is routing. So what routing is the path that audio takes through a device to, through the various buses that it's in. So let's see, an example might be the easiest way to explain routing. So now we've got the mixer here. To give an example of a route, let's look at this 1112 channel here. Say I wanted to send this to the main bus. The simplest route is for it to go simply straight to the main bus, by having this main bus button pushed in here. If for some reason I didn't want it to go directly to the main bus, it's also possible for me to take it out of the main bus, so now it's not going anywhere, send it to the auxiliary channel, and then I can send it to the main bus. Boom. And bam, it's now going through the aux bus and then to the main bus. So that is an example of different types of routing. So you can send audio different paths through the board and in many cases ultimately achieve the same result. Sometimes though, there may be specific reasons you want to do it that way, and we'll go through some examples of that in later videos. Okay, so now let's actually go through a tour of the mixer. We're going to start with the mono channels, which are these guys here. There's 4 of them on this mixer. So we'll start top to bottom. An important thing as we go through this, we're only going to go through one mono and one stereo channel because basically they're all duplicates of each other. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all the exact same. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, 12 are all the exact same. On the mono channels, we have an XLR input and a 1/4 inch input. Some important things to remember about this is you can only use one at a time, either the XLR or the 1/4 inch, but not both. If you plug both in, you'll get the XLR input. Next, we have a low cut button. What the low cut does is it reduces all sound below a certain frequency level. This is really helpful if you're plugging in a device that has a ground loop issue. You'll notice that by you'll hear a loud humming sound. Pushing that in will basically cut off all that sound. Ground loops are usually about 60 hertz. Most low cuts are about 75 hertz and below. Next, we have the gain. So the gain knob adds decibels of dBV to the input signal coming from the device that you have plugged in. Next, we have the compressor, which basically what a compressor does, it reduces the dynamic range between the lowest sound and the highest sound in a signal. It does this by reducing the overall decibel level of the highest sounds while not altering the lowest sounds very much. So what this does is it'll make ultimately your loudest sounds quieter, your quietest sounds won't change much. So you can add a little bit of gain, add some compression, and end up with the same volume level, but without much variation in volume level. Be careful with that though, because as you add more compression and increase gain to compensate, you're adding noise, because the noise didn't go away, but it does help you be more consistent with your volume level. Next we have EQ. So EQ or equalization lets you manage the frequency equals the frequencies within a signal. This is very important for things like microphones or instruments, which may not be perfectly represented, and their natural sound may not be represented by the microphone or the pickup in the instrument based on the room and what type of microphone and how far away the person is. So you can modify it here. Just the one thing to bear in mind with EQs is that you want to be gentle with them. You don't, I've got some that are turned pretty wildly, mostly with this lav because it's a horrible lav, but you don't want to go wild with your EQ, otherwise you can end up making a horrible sound out of a nice sound. We've got two kinds of EQ on this board. This EQ on the mono channels is a parametric EQ, so we have a high shelf, a low shelf, and then a parametric mid where I can set the level of the mid and then set the frequency of that mid. On the stereo channels, we don't have a parametric EQ. We have a 4-band EQ. We have a high shelf, a low shelf, and then a high mid and a low mid. Those are slightly different. The parametric EQs are really nice because they let you have a little bit more control over exactly what you're modifying. Next, we have the aux sends. So I'll go into the aux sends in a little more detail as we talk about aux buses. But essentially, you have the send for aux 1, the send for aux 2, and then a pre-selector here. So something to bear in mind with aux sends, they can be sourced pre-fader or post-fader, meaning they either get their sound from everything that is happening below here. So the panning level set within the fader and the mute switch will affect things that are sourced post-fader, but things that are sourced pre-fader will not be affected by that. If you have an aux send that is labeled MON, that's a monitor send or monitor aux bus. That is always sourced pre-fader. If it's labeled FX, it is an FX bus, and it is always sourced post-fader. Other aux sends may have a switch that lets you toggle between pre and post. All right, next we have the pan for the mono channel. That determines what percentage is going left versus right. Remember, this is a mono channel, so there's only one sound source here, but I can basically say I want to balance this more left or more right. I'll actually do that with the lav that I'm using here. You can see you're getting more sound out of the left than the right, and then more sound out of the right than the left. For most vocal stuff, you'll probably just leave it centered, but you may have reasons if, like, you have a podcast or something, you want to put one person to the left side, one person to the right side based on how the viewer is going to perceive them. Next, we have the mute switch. So the mute switch basically stops the sound from going to the fader. After that, we have the solo. So the solo is a special bus that is different than the buses otherwise on the board. Solo is basically interrupts anything that is happening on the control room. It cuts it out, and all you hear is the solo bus on the control channel. Doesn't affect the main channel at all, or the main bus at all, and you will hear the fader level of that channel. Some boards will have this guy right here, which is a pre-fader level switch, which turns the solo bus into a pre-fader level bus. And what that does is it essentially does the same thing as the solo. It cuts out the control room, and you only hear that channel or whatever channels are selected for solo, but you hear it immediately post-gain. No EQ and no fader. So that lets you set a good level for a microphone or other device using your gain before you start adjusting it with a fader. What you can do if you don't have it is you can set a fader to 0 and then solo it. And that's the same as a pre-fader listen. Next, we have on this board, we have routing selection. So not all mixers will have this. If you don't have it, then everything at this point is just going to the main bus. If you do have it, then you can select whether something goes to the main bus or a submix. That can be really handy. I find it very handy, especially when I want to have two separate mixes, one that I'm listening to while I'm streaming or podcasting, and one that my audience is listening to. Next, let's talk about the stereo channels. So the stereo channels, we've already gone through most of it. There's just a few minor differences. One is that you are going to have 2 1/4-inch plugs coming in, and you are expected to use both. If you do have something that you are only bringing in one channel, you can just plug it into the left and it'll act like a mono channel, and it'll split that and it'll evenly balance that between left and right. Or if you have both plugged in, it's going to treat it like a stereo channel. Next, you have this level selector. So this is either +4 decibels or -10 decibels of gain applied to the incoming signal. That's very common for stereo channels, although sometimes you will have an actual gain knob. Everything here is the same, other than, of course, the EQ, which we talked about. The only difference is balance. So here with pan, we were taking one signal that was evenly split between left and right, and we were assigning percentage left, percentage right. With balance on a stereo channel, you are not doing that necessarily. You already have a left signal and a right signal. All you're doing is you are deciding how much, the strength of the left versus the strength of the right. So it works very similar to if you've used a balance in a car for left-right. It's for a car stereo or something like that. It's not sending the right to the left channel or anything like that. It's just saying, give me more left, give me more right. All right. So that's everything in this main section of the board here. Next, let's talk about the aux buses. Okay, so aux buses, that's this section here. Essentially, all of these sends get pooled to this pot here. So when we turn up these, it's sending the audio to this pot. If this pot is all the way down, we've done nothing by turning them up here. When we turn this up, we're combining whatever we've sent here and giving it an overall level. That can either be sent out here, or if we have nothing plugged in there, it will immediately be sent to the aux return, and we can send it to the main bus. The FX does the same thing. Here you can see the FX, we actually have some functionality to either send it to the main bus or send it to the submix. And that's when you see this type of notation on a board, that means that up is main mix, down depressed is sub 1, 2. So next let's talk about the 2-track, and in this case the 2-track / USB. So these RCA inputs are the 2-track inputs and outputs. These buttons here control where the 2-track inputs or the USB input on this board is sent. This is for the control room, and this is for the main mix. An important thing to note is for the USB on this particular mixer, if I am taking the USB to the main mix, I cannot then send the USB back out. It will only do one or the other, not both. All right, so next let's talk about the submix here. Now we noted that we have the ability to send things to the submix or to the main mix. If we send things to the submix, it'll be left and right then on 1 and 2, just like left and right on the main bus. And we have the ability to assign 1 or 2 to the left and right of the main bus. So basically that's all we're doing here. It's an important note. If you do send something to the sub bus, that is 1 and that is 2. That is an even split between the two. For left and right, that's going to give me good left and right stereo to 1 and 2. For a mono channel, that's going to either assign it to the 1, to the 2, or to both evenly. Next, we've got the control room bus. So the control room bus is a little bit special. On this board, we have what's called a matrix source for the control room bus. I can select any or all of these different inputs. I can input from the 2-track or USB. I can input from the sub 1, 2 bus, or I can input from the main mix. And so that lets me have a lot more control over what I'm hearing on the control room or the headphones. And this is, of course, the level set for the headphones. Okay, finally we have the main bus itself. So the main bus on most mixers is where we are ultimately trying to get the sound to. If you are mixing for a podcast or a stream or something like that, this is going to be the sound that you're ultimately going to want to send to OBS or whatever broadcasting application you're using. A few notes about the main bus is that it is always tied to the 2-track outputs. So there's no level control for 2-track output versus main bus. They're one and the same. And in the case of this mixer being a USB mixer, that is also true of the USB output. Okay, so let's talk about a few things on the back of the mixer here real quick. Here on the mono channels, I've got what are called inserts. Basically what this lets me do is immediately after the gain, but before EQ or aux sends or anything else, I can send the audio back and then send the audio out and then get it back on this insert. So this is these are 1/4-inch TRS. These are 1/4-inch TRS plugs, and basically it is sending on the tip and receiving on the ring. So it's not really stereo per se. It is a mono channel, but using a breakout to send and receive. We also have a phantom power switch. So if you have a mic that takes phantom power, it's not necessarily good for it to plug it in and unplug it with the phantom power turned on. That can send a spike signal to the mic that can actually damage it. So you want to make sure if you are plugging in a mic that requires phantom power, make sure that is turned off. Let the system drain, and then plug it in, then turn it back on. All right, guys. So I hope this video was helpful as a tour of the mixer and the different functionality on it. I hope that it helps you understand what all of the switches and controls on your mixer do. Obviously, you're not going to have every single switch, dial, and button that this mixer has on your mixer. Some will be different. Just remember those basic core concepts that we talked about. At a high level, we're always sending sound to the main bus, and there are different routing options to send sound in other directions. If you did find this video helpful, go ahead and throw a like on it. Leave any comments below if you have additional questions or there are things you feel like I didn't cover well enough. Subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already so you can see more videos like this in the future. And if you did find this video helpful, please share it out to others. That really helps me. There's links below in the description to various places you can find me on the internet. Thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. Have a good one.